in the brutal summer of 1944. Days after the monumental D-Day landings, the colossal Allied advance, which had so confidently stormed the beaches, had been brought to a complete, bloody, and unexpected standstill. The obstacle was not a strategic fort or an elite panzer division, but an ancient agricultural relic, the hedgerow. These were not the polite, picturesque fences of England. The Norman hedgerows were massive, organic walls of earth, stone, and root, built by farmers over centuries to define their fields. Towering up to 15 feet high and often just as thick, their root systems plunged deep, creating an impenetrable natural rampart that defied conventional military engineering. Normandy had become a labyrinth, and every single field, separated by these towering dirt walls, was a self-contained, isolated killing zone. For the American tankers piloting the venerable Sherman tank, the hedgerows were a death sentence. The established military doctrine demanded that the tank must climb the wall. As it did, the Sherman's nose would tilt skyward, and for a few agonizing seconds at the crest, the thin belly armor, the vehicle's most vulnerable point, designed only to deflect light spall from below, not direct hits, was exposed. German soldiers positioned patiently on the other side were armed with Panzerfausts, or concealed anti-tank guns. They had perfected the deadly equation. Wait until the Sherman's underside appeared. Fire one shot, achieve one catastrophic kill. Over and over, the Sherman, the symbol of American mechanized power, was rendered tragically obsolete, turning into a burning coffin for its crew. The casualties mounted, the tactical timelines shattered, and the entire invasion threatened to stall into a prolonged, grinding war of attrition. The Germans didn't need to counterattack. They simply had to wait behind their earthen shields. Among the men forced to witness this daily, soul-crushing spectacle was Sergeant Curtis Culin of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. Culin was not a product of military academies or advanced engineering schools. His knowledge was forged in the pragmatic heat of a New Jersey garage. Before the war, he was a simple mechanic working on stubborn cars and trucks, dealing in the hard realities of leverage, force, and friction. But a good mechanic, Culin knew, was an intuitive problem solver. Every broken engine, every jammed transmission was a puzzle demanding an understanding of mechanical logic. As he watched the Shermans burn, the same catastrophic flaw repeated relentlessly. Something clicked in his pragmatic mind. The problem wasn't the strength of the hedgerow. The problem was the tank's flawed approach. The suicidal maneuver of climbing the wall was a concession to the obstacle's height. But what if you could change the obstacle? What if, instead of exposing the vulnerable belly in a climb, the tank could punch straight through the base of the wall, maintaining its nose-down attitude and keeping its thick frontal armor, the one surface built to withstand German fire, facing the enemy at all times? The German gunners could only kill what they could see, and if the tank never tilted up, the weak spot would remain hidden. The challenge was immense. How do you cut through 10 feet of compacted earth, stone, and ancient tangled roots? It would require a massive, focused application of force, delivered precisely at ground level. Culin began to sketch, filling a worn notebook with diagrams and calculations. His crewmates joked, "Cullen's gonna win the war with his pencil." They're ribbing a mix of affection and skepticism. After all, the best minds in the Allied command had failed to solve the hedgerow problem. What made one enlisted mechanic think he could succeed? Culin ignored the doubt. Mechanics were often underestimated. People confused working with your hands with a lack of intellectual capacity. But Culin knew that every successful repair was a victory of the mind. The hedgerows were just another form of stubborn, primitive machinery. They simply needed to be persuaded to move. He needed three things: a damaged but mobile tank, a source of scrap steel, and the blessing of an officer daring enough to believe him. He approached his commanding officer, Captain Samuel Morrison, with a proposal that sounded like battlefield delirium. Cullen wanted to take a damaged Sherman, one deemed fit for repair but not immediate combat, and weld massive steel prongs to its front. These prongs, he explained, would be salvaged from the German anti-tank obstacles, the Czech hedgehows that lay scattered like metallic bones across the D-Day beaches. The prongs, sharpened and hardened, would act like the tusks of a plow. The tank would ram the hedgerow at full speed, and the prongs would dig in low, severing the roots and ripping through the earthwork, forcing a path through the base. Captain Morrison listened, his face a landscape of disbelief. "Let me be clear, Sergeant," he said, the words slow and heavy. "Your plan is to take a 30-ton tank, weld scrap metal to it, and then deliberately drive it at speed into a solid wall of earth and stone. And this, you believe, will save the invasion?" "Yes, sir," Cullen affirmed, his calm a stark contrast to the madness of the proposal. "The current plan is to climb, which gets the crew killed. My plan is to punch through, which keeps the thickest armor facing the threat. The logic is sound, sir. The cost of trying is a damaged tank. The cost of not trying is the loss of the entire campaign's momentum." Morrison, a man hardened by witnessing the terrible cost of the status quo, finally broke. The risk was enormous, but the alternative was annihilation. "How long to build this thing?" 48 hours, sir," Cullen replied instantly. "Access to a torch, a welder, and the salvage obstacles. I will have a prototype ready for test." Morrison made the decision that would echo through history. 48 hours. If this fails, we both answer to General Bradley. If it works, Sergeant, you may have just saved the war. Cullen immediately began work. He requisitioned an acetylene torch, welding equipment, and a small crew. His quarry was the D-Day beaches, littered with the massive, three-pronged Czech hedgehows, hardened steel anti-tank obstacles that had failed to stop the initial landings but were now perfectly suited for Cullen's purpose. He and his crew worked through the night, the arc welding sparks sputtering like captured fireflies against the darkness. They cut the beams to the precise 4-foot length Cullen had sketched, sharpened the tips to a vicious point, and reinforced the welds until they were unbreakable. By the end of the first day, 4 massive steel prongs were ready. The next phase was critical, welding the prongs to the Sherman tank, which the crew immediately dubbed Rhinoceros. Cullen obsessed over the angles. The prongs had to be angled down at a precise 15 degrees, low enough to bite the earth at the hedgerow's base, but high enough to clear small debris. This downward angle was crucial. It ensured the force of the ramming would create downward leverage, keeping the tank's nose planted and the belly hidden. "You really think this'll hold, Sarge?" asked Private Eddie Kowalski, one of the welders, staring at the growing monstrous modification. "I know it will, Eddie," Cullen said, adjusting his mask. "The physics are solid. 30 tons of steel, driven by 500 horsepower, hitting Earth. Something has to yield, and it won't be this steel." By dawn on the second day, the Rhinoceros was complete, a bizarre, tusked mechanical beast that drew gasps and laughter in equal measure. Cullen, however, felt only a deep, nervous tension. The test would be the real verdict. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when the Rhinoceros rolled out for its trial, heading toward a particularly thick, 12-foot-high hedgerow. Captain Morrison and Major Williams, along with several other officers, gathered to watch. Cullen rode in the commander's cupola, his stomach a knot of dread. He was betting his career, the tank, and the lives of the volunteer crew, Corporal Mitchell driving, Sergeant Harrison gunning, on his calculations. Morrison gave the signal. The Sherman's engine roared, the tank gathering speed as it charged directly at the ancient earthen wall. The impact was a cataclysm of sound, a bone-jarring crash, followed by the sound of earth exploding outward and the sharp, shocking crack of centuries-old roots snapping like rifle fire. For a moment of pure terror, the tank stalled, completely embedded. The observers held their breath. Then, slowly, relentlessly, the Rhinoceros began to move. The prongs, working in perfect concert, dug deep, leveraged the tank's weight, and tore through the earthwork. The tank pushed forward, the engines screaming, until, with a final surge, it burst through the far side, emerging into the open field. It had created a perfect low-slung breach. The vulnerable underside had never been exposed. A spontaneous, roaring cheer erupted from the assembled soldiers. It had worked. Cullen felt a dizzying mix of relief and exhaustion. Mitchell's voice crackled over the intercom, jubilant. "Sarge, that was the smoothest crossing I've ever felt. We never even saw the sky." Major Williams immediately approached Cullen, all skepticism gone, replaced by a fierce, driving urgency. "Sergeant Cullen," he said, his voice clipped and decisive, "you're no longer the mad mechanic, you're the genius mechanic. I want 50 welders, all the steel we can find, and 100 tanks modified by the end of the week. I am reporting this immediately to General Bradley." Cullen, still pragmatic, insisted on the final test. "Sir, we must test this against a real German position, under fire. That's the only way to prove the concept." The final exam came at dawn the next day, against a massive hedgerow concealing a German strongpoint and, critically, a dreaded Panther tank. The rhinoceros led the charge. The first few hedgerows were easy, the prongs working flawlessly, shocking the Germans who scrambled to react before the Sherman's gun eliminated the threat. But at the final, biggest wall, with the Panther waiting, the impact was terrifyingly massive. The tank slowed, fighting for every inch. "More power," Cullen yelled, his voice strained. "Give it everything." The Sherman howled, its tracks churning, and then, with an earth-shaking lurch, it broke through. Sergeant Harrison, who had kept his gun trained on the expected enemy position, fired instantly as they emerged. The armor-piercing round hit the Panther's side, its weakest point, and penetrated. The enemy tank was neutralized before it could even turn its gun. The genius was proven. The rhinoceros had done in 2 hours what 3 days of conventional fighting had failed to achieve. The response from the Allied High Command was immediate and unprecedented. General Bradley ordered the mass production and deployment of the Culin hedgerow cutter. This was not a slow, bureaucratic process. It was an emergency, field-expedient order to save the invasion. Welding teams were diverted from engineering battalions, assembly lines were set up in open fields, and the remaining Czech hedgehogs became the most sought-after pieces of scrap in Normandy. Cullen, now promoted to technical sergeant, was assigned to train the welding crews across the theater, teaching the precise technique that ensured the prongs wouldn't snap under stress. 5,000 copies of his field modification were authorized for immediate installation. The innovation, born of common sense and desperation, had become the official doctrine of the U.S. Army in Europe overnight. The cutters fundamentally changed the nature of the fight. Tanks, now impervious to the hedgerow traps, could lead the attack again. Infantry, pouring through the breaches created by the rhinoceros tanks, could bypass the enemy's prepared killing zones. The agonizing advance of yards per day became a rapid, unstoppable push. Field reports confirmed the tactical revolution. The cutters were neutralizing the German defensive advantage in the bocage. As the Allied forces broke out of Normandy and pushed into open France, the Culin cutter's utility evolved. Tankers, the ultimate innovators, found new uses. The prongs became battering rams in urban warfare, smashing through brick walls to clear German snipers from buildings. In winter, they acted as massive snowplows, clearing paths through drifts. During the desperate defense, in the Battle of the Bulge, the cutters were used to push aside German roadblocks of felled trees, maintaining the crucial momentum of the counterattack. Cullen, now a master sergeant, traveled the front, documenting these new uses, always emphasizing that the true genius came from the soldiers in the field who adapted the tool. However, the success carried a profound moral and logistical cost. The cutters accelerated the fighting, saving countless Allied lives by shortening the campaign, but also pushing infantry into more aggressive, high-casualty attacks. Logistical teams struggled to keep up with the tanks that were suddenly advancing faster than any planner had anticipated. Culin wrestled with the terrible paradox. His invention saved lives, but it did so by making the war more efficient and deadly. He sought solace in the knowledge that his tool had helped end the conflict faster. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Culin hedgerow cutter was a standardized part of the Sherman tank's design. General Eisenhower credited it as one of the most significant tactical innovations of the war. Culin returned home to New Jersey, carrying medals and a quiet, profound conviction. He went back to his garage, fixing cars and trucks, refusing to discuss his wartime fame. "I was a mechanic," he would say. "Fixed tanks, nothing exciting." He would not claim glory for a tool that, while saving American lives, was ultimately designed to help kill. Years later, a historian would track him down, asking if he understood the magnitude of his unplanned genius. Cullin's final words on the matter became his enduring legacy. "I wasn't special. I was just a guy who knew how machines worked and saw a problem that needed solving. The special part was that the Army gave me a chance to try. They looked at the idea, not at who was suggesting it." That's the real lesson, that good ideas can come from anywhere, if you're willing to listen. The invention of the Culin hedgerow cutter stands as a timeless testament to field-expedient ingenuity, the power of common sense over complex engineering, and the invaluable contribution of the quiet mechanic in the greatest conflict of the 20th century.